get started.
Okay. Way back. Oh, you don't? Oh, okay.
My Jabber client's not so
Yeah, I have a problem with Java.
and we have no participants in eDeco, so that needs to place in there. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to BFD at IETF 105 in Montreal. This agenda today is mostly dedicated towards discussion about futures of BFD, so we'll try to get to that piece of the presentation fairly quickly. So the agenda today, relatively short in the grand scheme of things. We'll be having a presentation on service redundancy from Sammy. Greg will give an update from his last version of presentation on BFD, basically extended features, and we're going to be using that as a seed discussion specifically for BFD V2 stuff. If we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll also pull up some backup slides for the working group last call stuff from BFD for VXLAN. Key things out of that one is BFD for VXLAN has actually completed working group last call, and as part of ISG and other review, Greg has been working to try to resolve a lot of last minute comments that we've gotten, especially from people from NVO3. We'll be sending out a summary of the outstanding issues to the mailing list and some requests for further review from BFD once we've resolved their comments. And we're likely to take that to a secondary working group last call based on that output. The unsolicited BFD document is effectively stable and ready for working group last call. We will actually kick that off after this session. BFD for large packets is also stable, and more importantly, Albert has actually done some experimental work on the FRR routing stack to make use of the feature, and we see that it actually does interop with itself in standard mode and also Junos VMX and potentially other stuff. I have like 2 slides I'll be flipping through to give you some data there. It's potentially ready for working group last call. We do a little bit more testing with actual forwarding hardware, considering that we know that real hardware makes a big difference for BFD, considering where it lives inside line cards in many cases. One point that we did actually want to take a little bit of time from the chair stuff, and this will be Mahesh. The BFD authentication documents that we had specifically for optimizing BFD and the procedures around that had gone through last call, had not received a lot of feedback. Getting the last call feedback at BFD is sometimes tricky as it stands. The thing that was the main sticking point was that Mahesh's former employer had done an IPR declaration on the stuff, and the text of the declaration does follow the standard IETF reasonable and non-discriminatory status in terms of what they're applying to the IPR. What is not on there is text that we tend to see that is somewhat comparable for like Cisco and Juniper as examples, where there's also a clause stating that it is license free or it's license free pending action. The text in there does suggest that license free is potentially an option, but they also exclude cases where licensing fees may be required. Mahesh, did you want to comment on what the IPR person actually had said directly?
Right. So what the legal department at Sienna, which is the company that filed the IPR, said is that they looked at the template of the IPRs that had been submitted against the BFT working group. And in their mind, they kind of followed middle of the line text as it was concerning this particular pattern, and felt that their language was no stronger, no weaker than the other part and the IPRs that were declared in the BFT working group. And so their summary was essentially that they are no better, no worse off than.
Oh, wow. It's outside the hallway.
Okay. I'm not IPR expert, but we had a discussion on a different document, and the document used the similar to Siena language, and that was interpreted as clearly potential for implementation. So what they're saying is, I disagree. There is clearly a clearly different disclosure language that Jeff characterized, and one of them is characterized as covenant, which is different from friend. And covenant can be interpreted as a stick behind your back. So that says that I would not impose royalties unless you go after me. Okay, so that's, I think, that understood as most common form of license disclosure at IETF. So if you go after me, then I will pull my guns and go after you.
Right, and we sort of jokingly refer to that as the nuclear option. In
Yeah, or nuclear option. Yeah, that's, but in legal terms, it referred as a covenant.
Right, and I think it's mutually not assertive is one of the other terms that I think popped up in that conversation. So it was clear in looking at the back and forth that was forwarded to us that the lawyer in question did understand what we were asking, and it was their opinion that the disclosure as currently filed was sufficient for that purpose. The problem is, of course, these are lawyers we're talking about, and exactly what interpretation you're going to get is going to depend on the mood for the day of the week.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, not to try to belabor this one way or the other, because we're not going to necessarily, we're not going to change their mind based on what we've seen.
Mhm.
And certainly, if any of you have relationships with Siena, certainly feel free to try to work in through the back door and talk about that. But more importantly, in terms of what do we do as a working group, the lawyer in question did actually point out at least 2 IPR disclosures against 5880 itself, that were not covered in similar ways, like Juniper and Cisco, as we weren't the only ones that filed disclosures on the technology. And at least a couple of those also were missing the nuclear options in there as well. So there is precedent within BFD of technologies being covered in such a way. We do have the option as a working group to proceed, as calling the documents and just go through the procedures. And the best thing we can actually say is that, compared to some of the 5880, and I can forward the IPR declarations that were referenced to us, as comparisons, but we do have other IPR against 5880 that follow a similar pattern. So we do have it within our option to proceed if we so choose.
Do I have to go to?
Oh,
Yeah, we can sit there.
this mic is-
Why don't you
this mic is
sit there? It's going to be easier.
I have my stuff here. You can use the mic up front.
Okay.
Well, yes, there is a history, but the thing is that always the question is whether this IPR is applicable to document.
So whether.
And yes, and I know that everyone has to decide and draw the conclusion, and we're not discussing IPR here. So that's what I want to say, is that even there might be a disclosure which uses front language at the time of progressing these documents, people might have decided that this IPR is not applicable. That's one. Another thing is that what I want to mention is that their update to extended BFD that will be presented today will be on proposed authentication option, which functionally, I believe, addresses what's been addressed in this draft. And as I understand, even then, there is potential that IPR disclosure will be filed, but as I know, their potential holder of this IPR follows the covenant.
Yeah, and it is certainly IETF practice that if IPR is decided to be unacceptable for the working group, that alternative methods can be used. So will be one of our discussion points when we get around to your presentation.
Yeah.
So I think where we are probably at this point is, a mail will go out to the mailing list to see if people are willing to take this through the last call procedure. And if so, we'll do a final editorial pass on things since it has gone through last call before, and then decide how to dispatch from there. And we certainly can hold up publication requests, even if we decide to move ahead or hold it, based on further discussion about other mechanisms for authentication.
Just one comment, Rakesh from Cisco. There is an RFC 4736, and that has a similar kind of issues, and then it was published as an informational RFC.
You're welcome to use the microphone.
Again, that's what I try to stress, is that the fact that there is a filed IPR against the IETF document, we all encouraged to look at IPR and see whether we believe it's applicable. Yes, I myself, I looked at some IPR with their front covenant and looked at it and said, well, I would not advise to file it because it's not applicable. Okay, but there are different cases. The IPR might be not applicable, and then, yeah, I would support it because,
So, Greg, I want to make sure I understand what you're proposing here. You're proposing that we look at the IPR?
Yes, I propose that when this mail goes for the working group to consider how we proceed with this draft, is take your time, do this good service, look at IPR and decide whether you believe it's applicable or not.
Martin Vigoureux, speaking as a routing AD. I agree with you, Greg, but on an individual basis.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
We're not discussing.
Yeah, but since you didn't explicitly mention it, and we were discussing working group operations.
Yes, again, everyone has to come to this conclusion himself. At IETF, and I was told many times, now I learned it, we're not discussing applicability of IPR. So that's why I'm not really saying what I believe in.
Generic, so similar point. But we must keep in mind that whatever we may agree on with respect to the applicability of the IPR, we're not a court that will decide. And so the IETF consensus or working group consensus on that won't prove anything on what might happen in front of a court. So we must be careful with that.
Yes, I agree. So if somebody has access to IPR lawyer expertise, you can ask them to give you more professional judgment. But again, by reading their document, I think that we can come to the reasonable conclusion sufficient to basically saying, well, there is no risk because it's kind of stretched too far, or saying, well, it's a pretty much close call.
David Black, TSVWG Working Group Chair, got up basically a +1 Greg's comments that I think the big takeaway I hope people take from this is that nothing substitutes for your own technical judgment about what is going on. Please don't get carried away focusing solely on what the lawyers did.
So if there's no further feedback, I'm going to just quickly flash through 2 slides from Albert on BFD for large packets. Decided to take the session time and not actually spend it on an update for the presentation. Albert did actually do a little bit of changes to the FR routing stack. It ended up being a couple lines of code as we are all discussing. All the padding was actually done at the IP layer, and tested this versus the unmodified FRR stack and also the VMX stack from Juniper, which is a virtual machine-based forwarding stack. And the feature does seem to work as expected. And in case you want to actually dig into the packet contents, he does supply that as well. So I think partially with this is justification. Once we get a little bit more interop, we may actually move forward with the last call. This feature ended up being probably about as simple as we were expecting it to. I think the only interesting potential holdup is how the BFDV2 discussions end up resolving. Did you want to save this for your presentation, Greg?
Yeah. So I will save it for the list.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're ready for next actions. Sorry, who's the next one? Next one, service redundancy. This might work. Might work. Okay.
Yeah, good afternoon. I guess still in the afternoon. So my name is Sami Boutros with VMware. So I'm presenting this draft. This draft here about how can BFD help with some service redundancy. So next slide. Okay. Oh, thank you. So yeah, I think this slide has most of the information that I would like to describe here. So the idea here is that in a network where we want to offer service redundancy across multiple nodes, like shown here. So those services could be layer 2 or layer 3 or even layer 4 services or even layer 7. So we have multiple nodes offering the services, and in general, especially layer 4 services and above are offered in active standby mode, not really in active because they tend to create state related to the flows passing by the nodes. So the idea here in such use case, in such network, we typically would have a protocol like BFD to check the liveness between the node offering the service actively and the standby node. Just in case the node offering the service actively goes down, then the standby node will take over, right? With those services, sometimes as well, after a failure, we need to support what we call non-revertive mode. Non-revertive meaning that if the standby takes over a given service, then we don't want that service to go back to the active when he comes back up. So now if you are running BFD between the nodes, the active and standby detected that the active went down, he will take over. But now when the active comes back up and the BFD session between the old active and the standby who recently got activated comes back up, we need somehow to tell the standbys that became active to tell the old active that I was up while you were down. And we are supporting non-revertive for this service or for whatever services that we are offering that's being offered here with redundancy by us. Don't take over the service that you were active for. So for that, we are talking about a small extension to BFD, a new diag code by which a node that detected the failure of another node can tell that other node when it comes back up that I was up while you were down. And that would help, as I mentioned, in the non-revertive case, meaning in the non-revertive case, the old active, as I was explaining, wouldn't take over the service because the standby survived the failure or was active during the failure. Of course, if both the active and standby went down, then the standby wouldn't activate anything because both failed, and that diag code will not be used. What we are proposing further here, and I guess it will be part of another discussions that will be done in the working group later today, is using the payload to communicate some optional bitmap about the services that are offered by the nodes here. So especially in the non-revertive mode, in the example I just mentioned, if the standby is activated for those service, it can send the diag code and optionally can send a bitmap of the service that it took over, right? So it tells the active, yes, we are honoring the non-revertive mode, and I am going to take over those, I already took over, sorry, those set of services described in a bitmap that can be configured via controller that you saw in the picture on the first slide. So I think, yeah, with that, that's about it. So the new DAC code that this node was up when the peer node failed is what we are extending. And of course, the bitmap will be part of the V2 discussion. So any comments? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
AC Lind of Cisco Systems. So you're going to have a single BFD session have different preempt statuses dependent on the diag code? You know, like if you have more than one service, some would,
it's not a BFD session per service. It's a BFD session for the liveness of the node.
No, I know that. But
okay.
you're having, but it's usually it's all or none, right? All services or no services, right? That's the way it is today. We have preempt mode. We already have this revertive, non-revertive. That's been in BFD since the beginning, right?
No.
No. Oh wait, I'm thinking of VRP. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh, it's VRP preempt. Okay, that's so it's really simple then. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Sure. Thanks.
Sam Aldrin. I have one fundamental question here.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're monitoring the link between the nodes as
it may not be a link, right? You know, the nodes.
So I mean the BFD session, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So and interpreting that as node failure.
Correct.
But that may not be right. So how can you?
Oh, okay. I think what you are talking about cases where you have a split brain, for example, right? and so on, right? So this is, you have a point. In split brain kind of scenario in which maybe both of them will think that the other guy is down, didn't survive the failure. But at least when they come back up, especially for non-revertive service, if one of them is saying, okay, hey, I was up, then the other guy can figure out, okay, yeah, he was up, he took over services, maybe I should bring it down on my side, if the split brain get corrected.
Right, but the assumption you're making is that the connectivity between nodes is equivalent to the node failure.
You're right, but it's not a node failure in split brain scenario. This is what, but we can definitely put some clarification on split brain. If split brain would happen, then what should be the behavior? Thank you.
Greg Mirsky, ZTE. Forgot it. So one question is that you think that only scenarios that you need to cover are when you have active and standby, that you cannot have more nodes that can provide the service, the same service. So let's saying that you might have 3 nodes, one is active standby and other is DR other.
Mm-hmm.
So once, for example, and there might be interesting scenarios. For example, your standby goes down and the other becomes a standby. Or
correct, yeah.
your active goes down, then standby takes as active and other becomes standby.
Correct, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what I'm driving to is that the point-to-point BFD is the best mechanism. Might be look at BFD for multi-point networks, because what we found is that for scenarios, and AC mentioned VRRP. For VRRP, point-to-multipoint works very nicely. And point-to-multipoint, I'm for short for multi-point networks. So now it's at the RFC 8562, I believe. Works nicely for a case of, for example, PMSM, when you have multiple PMSM routers on a shared segment.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, your active just has is a head end of the session, and all others, DR or VDR backup or others, are listening.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, we might think about how to insert the notion of whether active is non-revertive, saying that I'm non-revertive, and regardless of your priority, you should wait till I go down. Okay, so let's maybe take to the list and talk about and think whether point-to-multipoint BFD is provide more generic solution, because otherwise you have to have multiplicity of point-to-point session for the same service.
I think, yeah, in the document, we described only one use case in which the service is active standby. So we don't have the other, but definitely, I mean, it could be an option to consider, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other stuff, but the DIAC code here, how helpful the DIAC code is simply to say I was up when you went down, and or I think I was up when I detected that you were down. And of course, using that capability, you can build on it many other use cases, not only the use case.
So Sami, we're close to 10 minutes behind schedule. So after Santosh, we take the rest of the discussions to the list, please.
Okay.
Santosh from VMware. I just have a comment on this particular bitmap that we are sending. It's a comment for the working group itself. Like time and again, we are introducing new payloads for BFD and increasing the IP header. So I guess this should be considered for BFD version 2 or the extended BFD, where we just introduce this as a capability and negotiate it. probably we can just wait for that discussion.
Sure, exactly. And yeah, I'm looking forward for that discussion too. Thank you.
And you actually asked the question I was going to. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So it sounds like we have some good discussion material on the mailing list. I do agree that the point-to-multi-point is probably a better technology setting question, but this does bring us to where do we put the rest of the data? And conveniently, Greg is going to kick us off that question.
Okay, so it works or not?
Clicker may or may not work.
Okay, then I'll appreciate if you help me.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next right away. So again, quickly go further what we talked about in Prague. The motivation is there have been several ideas of what we want to do with BFD. One of them is to monitor and quantify the quality of BFD sessions. So because normally BFD is used for the detect multiplier 3, which means that there might be loss of up to 2 BFD control packets, and still the BFD session will stay up. But that might be used as some indicator of the problem in the network, sort of a very crude performance monitoring method. Saying if we say that you're losing 2 packets out of 3, that's some clue. Then the performance measurement and path MTU large packets. We're trying to use existing mechanics that BFD provides, and there are numerous implementations and many implementations hardware assisted to do more things, just path continuity verification. So what we said the goal is that it has to be backward compatible and extensible mechanism. And another motivation is that to provide somewhat intermediate authentication for BFD session, because what we discussed first, the proposal was addressing it to allow more lightweight authentication, because otherwise authentication is very computational heavy, especially if they're asynchronous mode at 3.3 millisecond. Next slide, please. So the proposal is that to use or reuse BFD control message as is, as defined in 5880. Well, we thought of some guard word as additional possible way of saying, well, it's just random memory or it's really extended BFD. Well, let's discuss it. And then followed by TLV as very generic and commonly accepted method of doing extensibility. TLVs can be enclosed, so there will be TLVs and sub-TLVs. And let's see what it gives us. Next slide, please. So for the extended capability, it starts with a capability negotiation, which is done for their poll sequence. By default, there is no extended BFD, and then the active node advertises its capability of what is being requested. And capability negotiation can be done at any state of BFD. So for now, we are considering to do loss delay measurement, and loss delay measurement could be either periodic or poll. Periodic, it's thinking of being done in asynchronous mode, or might be demand mode. So where the packets periodically send and are given in the configured interval. When we talk about this in Prague, it was a very good question about, okay, what do we want to do in 3.3 milliseconds? Well, if somebody proposes you
that they want to do periodic, for example, loss measurement, the other side might say, well, I'm not doing it 3.3 milliseconds. I can do it at 100 milliseconds. So the pole sequence allows and already exists a mechanism of saying, well, how about this? Oh no, I'm not doing this. And then they can negotiate what they do. They might arrive to conclusion that, okay, it would not work. And that would be fine. So that's basically, again, existing nice functionality of BFD, the pole sequence, that it's negotiation, which comes to certain conclusion indicated by setting the final bit. And now we're introducing their lightweight authentication. We can go to the next slide.
Great.
Yes.
Just answer. So are you proposing to decouple liveliness from the new capabilities?
Again, there could be that liveliness would be monitored by one BFD session, and another BFD session may be brought up for extended. But at the same time, what I would like to point is that there are pole mode. So everything can be done in pole mode. And pole mode is a query. It's like a ping. Pole mode in pole sequence in BFD works as a query. So one sends the pole, another looks at it and responds either with its pole or with the final. So
I understand.
it's more on-demand mode. So basically, on-demand mode of using extension, I believe, can be coupled with their connectivity verification, continuity check with a regular BFD asynchronous mode.
You envision that you would still do continuity at 3.3, but would send delay measurement every 20th packet, or how do you see two disjoint timers working together?
That's a good question. I need to look at how we can control the frequency of the pole through this negotiation. Yeah, maybe it will require additional specification when we do capability for the pole that we need to negotiate the timing of this. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Great, Santosh from VMware. Now, with this negotiation capability, if we are doing in the same session, right? So if we are doing a poll and the other guy doesn't support this and is not sending a final, isn't it that will bring down the session?
Well, again, as I mentioned, I think that this capability negotiation can be done at any stage. So, for example, so the regular BFD session is already up. Then we want to negotiate saying that, okay, I want to have loss and delay measurement done in a pole mode using pole sequence. And as Jeff suggested that, yes, we need to specify what would be the frequency of these measurements. And the other side says, no, I don't want to do it at all.
No, in this case, I'm saying that the other guy just doesn't support the extended BFD.
Yeah.
So in this case, you're sending a poll and he's not replying back to you because he's just dropping the packet.
Oh, okay. If other guy doesn't support poll, you should still operate in a normal classical BFD.
Okay. So because currently in 5880, if poll is not responded with the final, for 3 packets, we just drop the session itself.
No, right. If, again, that's basically what I'm suggesting, that if no extended BFD, and I think that there is some wording in a document we discussed in Prague, is that if extended poll doesn't go, so the
sender has to conclude the other side doesn't support extended BFD and can revert back to classical BFD.
Okay. Okay.
So basically, he will need to send normal poll without extension and just negotiate the timers, not the capabilities.
Okay.
Okay, so authentication capability, their authentication field in a capability TOV is a variable length field, which characterizes what the length of authentication and what the authentication type are supported by the sender. And the idea is that if they both support extended BFD and or support lightweight authentication, they advertise their capability, and then they select the largest authentication and the highest authentication mode. So currently we are proposing a couple modes. One of them, so basically, since there was a discussion that password and MD5 are not sufficient security, we're not including it, but if community and working group believes that they should be included, then obviously it's all just, just to have a discussion.
So, Greg, there is existing spec on how to do SHA-1, SHA-2 for BFD. It's documents we've worked through before, and it fits into the existing BFD header. How is this supposed to be different than that? Or you're not familiar with that older set of specs?
How to do it? Or, no, again, the known, this SHA-1 and meticulous SHA-1, it will be done the same way.
You would put this into the capability here rather than the existing authentication header. Why?
Well, because the thing is that existing authentication header is that it tied to the configuration. So in existing 5880 definition of how we do authentication in BFD is once it's configured, it has to be in each and every packet. What we are proposing is that authentication capability is only used in a poll sequence.
This is for the occasional stuff.
Yes.
That was not clear from this slide.
Yes, it's actually authentication is explicitly not to be, well, at least we are not proposing to be done in periodic messages because and we had this discussion with the other proposal that if we do this in periodic messages, it creates a lot of complexity of when do you declare your session down. With authentication capability, if it's done in a poll, then even if your authentication fails, you can receive a notification whether you're not receiving final bit or you receive the final with the error code. We're introducing the error code here, and then you can draw the conclusion what you do with the session. You can take the session down, or you will say, okay.
So, Greg, why don't you just stay where you are, since I think you're going to be part of the next conversation. Let's load the next slide deck. We're starting to see people drift out of the room, and make sure that we don't lose
Okay,
people.
so yeah, you can go through the slides which explain how the authentication works and how it's being used. No, for further, the flow chart. Yeah, the flow chart, and then, yeah, and the only thing is that authentication can be combined with other extensions, but if it's the case, then authentication obviously has to be the last TLD.
So I'm going to suggest we move along to the next piece of slides that I have, to kick off the V2 presentation. If you have, is there a quick question on this?
Yeah, the Rakesh from Cisco. So
very inspiring. Good timing.
So for TWAMP, we had control channel signaling, and I think you introduced STAMP. to eliminate some of this control channel signaling and complexity in the network, to simplify, using TWAMP, right? Using the provisioning model. So by adding a lot more complexity in this capability and signaling in BFD, I think we're going in the other direction for BFD.
So pause there. Let's actually take this as partial jump off.
Actually, I want to say that in the stamp we put up the requirement that there is a backward compatibility with the T1 white in unauthenticated mode. And there is special mechanism in stamp that ensures this. So here, what we are putting is that ensuring the backward compatibility with the classical BFD.
And that's where we sort of move into the next bit of the conversation. So I'm just going to kick this off partially with some of the slides we had at Prague. What's our motivations for extending things? We had BFD as a very thin protocol. The question I always ask is, what do you want to do every 3 milliseconds? Our extensions can't break our core use cases, and we've said no a lot over the years to try to keep these things true. And we've still managed to do extensions when they've made sense. We've talked about, how can we extend? I sort of opened up the genie bottle by showing that we can stick stuff at the end of the packet. That was a trick I've been holding in my back pocket for a number of years. However, it doesn't interact with authentication as it's specified in the core draft right now. A BFD v2 could obviously solve a lot of these things without going through a bunch of tricks, and I suspect that's where we'll get driven very quickly, and we'll have to figure out backward compatibility for it. We know that fast things in TLVs don't usually get along. One of the things we do tend to see that is a workaround for that, IP fix, as an example, has the idea of templates that allow you to send information very quickly that's still structured. So there's ways around what to do, but really the motivation, and thank you all that are coming here from outside the usual BFD stuff. The bigger question is, it's time to open up the conversation. Why are we trying to do some of the stuff in BFD? And we have, as examples of stuff that we've done before, we have some of the timing, loss delay measurement type stuff that has been previously covered by IPPM type stuff. They obviously have their IOAM work, and how that might interrelate here is one of the interesting pieces of the conversation. When we start adding in new stuff, and we had our, as the example from your presentation, if we're in LDM mode, we might actually want to either spin up a new session, we might want to downshift our speed. There's obviously changes to the core of how BFD is going to behave in such circumstances. So we're already at the point of, this isn't really standard BFD anymore. And the bigger problem for us, from perspective of our AD, is these things are sort of weekly in charter to start with, and we keep on getting pressure to open things up. And the reason why we need to really look at this stuff comes down to, I think, a very simple thing. I mentioned this on the mailing list. BFD is a popular protocol, for the same reason that things like BGP and DNS are popular. It has a particular structure that is appealing to certain types of work. BGP is popular for interdomain. That's what it's used for. DNS is a effectively distributed database from its design. The thing that's sort of popular about BFD is that it's a continuous channel between two systems and provides a place where you can potentially put all sorts of interesting things. So, using this as a motivation for discussion, and this is where I'd like to see a lot more participation from people from outside the working group. BFD might be an interesting channel. We don't necessarily have to put things into the core BFD, 5880 case itself. It's a great mechanism for doing our continuity checks. It's very popular. It's very successful. Nothing stops us from taking exactly the same mechanism set that's made BFD popular and potentially just cloning it off into maybe a different UDP port, different encapsulation type, something that runs at a different speed, that can carry along extra information when it makes sense for this conversation, perpetual conversation between two systems. So the question I'd like to see to the room is, it's like, we don't have to change BFD itself from the core use case, but as we start expanding things out to, this is a nice property, does this make sense to hand this off to a different working group as an example? Would, for example, IPPM benefit from having a BFD-like exchange where they can hook on things like IOAM? Or we had a situation where there's other IETF OAM mechanisms, because IETF really doesn't do OAM. You're a big advocate of that. Is there other groups that we should really start having this conversation with? And I open this to the room.
Actually, Jeff, what I want to note is that at least authentication, what we want to do authentication of that particular session, not the parallel session, because authenticating parallel session doesn't really serve the purpose.
Yeah, I'm not strongly sold when we were doing the authentication. We obviously have a body of work that had gotten all the way to last call covering authentication. So that's sort of a weaker case for me.
But for, again, there were proposals, and I talked with one of the authors of the quality of BFD session. And again, if we want to quantify their quality of BFD session, we probably want to quantify quality of that particular BFD session.
Right, but the question is for like quality of BFD session, is that something that's more of an IPPM type, discussion, or is it something else?
I mean, you could do that with IOAM, and I see Frank is lining up there. Maybe you see the same thing. I don't know. Yes, no. I'm putting words in your mouth. Sorry.
It's about something else. Okay. Let's keep the line.
Sorry, Matthew Botchley, Nokia. So this discussion reminds me of the same deliberations we went through with MPLS-TP. And we discussed back in the day, using BFD to do LMDM and all these other functions that were required for MPLS-TP, and we decided not to because we either already had tools to do that, or we didn't want to overload the nice, lightweight, fast mechanism that we had with BFD. And we went about as far as extending BFD in the sense that we allowed it to do connectivity verification as well as connectivity check. And we used a separate control channel for doing that. So we then went ahead and created all these other like LMDM, for MPLS performance monitoring, and created a kind of a framework where you could slot in all these different tools nicely in the MPLS context to run together. So I guess the question is, why specifically do you want to use or replicate these mechanisms or replicate similar functionality in BFD when we already have these tools, they're already working?
Well, actually, in regard to proposal to do performance monitoring with BFD, it doesn't add, it reuses 6374. So it reuses their messages defined in loss and delay measurement in MPLS networks.
Right, but it's not 6374 specifically. And you already have those tools, you already have tools for doing loss and delay.
Well, the thing is that 6374 only defines the format. It doesn't define how you do testing and how you do negotiation. And if I remember correctly, there was even an issue with the unidirectional measurement. So, because if receiver receives this metrics, so what did you do? So they had to invent extension saying, okay, you take this and then you forward to somewhere else. 6374 it's a nice mechanism, and I like it because it uses fixed messages that are symmetrical in size if it's done one-sided two-way measurement. But I think that it lacks some of their mechanics. And as Jeff said, BFD provides some mechanism. And for example, this measurements doesn't have to be done on 3.3 millisecond. The measurements can be done using the pulse sequence
in a way how, for example, stamp works, sender reflector, and provide very nice performance monitoring tool.
It sounds like you're basically reusing the negotiation capabilities from BFD for these other various tools rather than, it's not strictly BFD anymore.
Yes, and that's another like reuse rather invent. So that's another motivation. Yes, we have this nice tool of pulse sequence negotiation, and why not use it for the other purpose?
Frank Brockner, Cisco. Well, I think negotiation and maybe also kind of more flexible authentication, I get that. For doing things that embark into performance measurements, I'm not entirely sure, right? Because I think one of the assets, I think you phrased it very well earlier on, is BFD is accepted because it's simple and you can't put loads of shit into it, which is why people run it. If we are opening up that to be really flexible, does that hamper acceptance? I don't know. Because we could also, and maybe we should go, before jumping into the extensibility debate, we should go and figure out what we want to go and do and what we can go do with existing tools. If you have a parallel session that runs TWAM, stamp, whatever, what can you get from that? If you put stuff like IOM into the messages that you're exchanging, what can you get from that? And based on that, maybe you can come to a conclusion where we say, well, this is a specific gap that is small enough so that we're not overloading BFD.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we're not replicating all that other stuff, because once you're opening up the thing to be doing anything, then you might actually hamper BFD's acceptance, and that might be bad, right? Because we don't want to go and lose this asset that we indeed run a channel between two entities that might not even be friendly to each other, to the extent I'm connecting two different domains, and I still want to go and tell you that my router went down.
Yeah, I would note that IOM is one-way measurement, and basically it has a problem that was found in 6374 one-way measurements, that what you do with this metrics, you need to export it. What nice about using pulse sequence for performance measurement, it's similar to TWAMP and STAMP, is that this is a one-sided two-way measurement. So basically the sender receives the measurement results and can calculate the metrics. And that's usually the more operationally friendly mode. Right, but again, so that's why I would not compare IOM with this proposal.
Santosh from VMware. So my take on this is, let's not open up BFD for the entire capabilities that we can do with other protocols. But at the same time, we really need this some bit of an extension to BFD. The reason being that, we have done BFD stability draft, which is like, where we really want to see if the BFD packets were getting dropped, right? I mean, it was happening because in one of the hardware, the BFD packets were getting dropped in the host path when the packet was received, while the link was up, everything was working fine. So this was one of the features that we really wanted to enable and disable on the fly for a given BFD session. So BFD itself, we wanted to see whether it is stable or not. Having said that, the bitmap that Sami just explained about the for service that he wants to negotiate. For that matter, he has come up with, Greg talked about few other capabilities. So these are very lightweight capabilities which you want to switch on and off for a given BFD session. Probably we can do that, but we are not saying that we can just use the, or at least my take is that we should not use BFD for doing the loss measurement or whatever at all the time, but just switching on and off is what I think.
Yeah. Again, and I agree, thank you. We can be very conservative with what we put in. If we decide that performance monitoring is too much, even in a POEM sequence, sure.
Sam Aldrin. I have three-part question. First one is, do you even know what exactly it cannot do? The proposal, in the sense, like the scope is so wide. Now we are trying to say that it can do anything. Is that right?
No, I'm not saying it can do
So
anything.
maybe we should define what exactly it can do than saying that it can do all of them. So if you know what it cannot do, then it's good. So that at least we can constrain the problem. The second aspect is, do we know who is asking this?
Well, as in motivation, I pointed to that we had several proposals to use BFD for things other than continuity check.
Okay, so maybe I think it's alluding to what Matthew asked, like we need to do the due diligence of what the existing tools out there cannot do. The third aspect is related to this, because how exactly it's going to play out with the existing mechanisms in various working groups, which already does some or all or even part of the problems we are trying to solve with this.
Right, but like Santosh mentioned, we had discussed, and actually working group adopted this draft on BFD stability, and it to characterize BFD itself. So nobody else does it.
What do you mean, like the OEM parts, nobody else does it?
Right, because basically there is no mechanism to say how many BFD control packets out of N packets being dropped.
No, I'm not talking about the mechanisms. I'm talking about the function.
Yes, this
what
function.
Exactly it's going to do. For example, the PM kind of things.
No, it's again, this function characterizes their stability of BFD session. Okay, so BFD has this detect multiplier parameter, which tells how many packets in a row will constitute their failure. So if you lose one less packet comparing out of detect multiplier, your session will stay. But is it considered stable session? Is it a good session? So till now, there is no mechanism to know that. There is no BFD variable that characterizes how many BFD packets you have lost.
Okay, maybe we are talking totally different things. We can talk offline.
Yeah, no, but again, what I'm saying is that there are very specific mechanisms that we discussed in BFD group over period of time that are needed for BFD. And the proposal is to use the extension mechanism to do this. So basically, it's not only for performance monitoring on the link that where BFD runs, on the path that BFD runs. It's just to characterize BFD itself. At the same time, so as we discussed earlier, so the authentication mode is...
Greg, I'm going to have to cut you. We're at time, so what I'm going to suggest is let's go ahead and work through comments for the rest of the microphone. You know, this was not meant to be the challenge Greg portion of the session. Although thank you. Although thank you for providing the impetus for the conversation. So let's work through here, and then I have potentially some closing.
I have no problem with that.
So Rakesh from Cisco Systems. So I think the current market direction is to simplify the control plane, even eliminate it using the automation, and also the merchant silicon, right? So the simplified way of forwarding packets. So the two things, so one is that in IPPM working group, if you see the direction they have been taking is to simplify or even eliminate the control channel signaling. At the same time, if you look at the TWAMP messages or even the stamp messages, there are messages where there is a fixed offset, so you know exactly the merchant silicon will know exactly where to put a timestamp, where to put a counter, right? And also the message size is very small. So because the memory is very small to load the payload, the merchant silicon would also know that I only need to load that much of, it cannot write like byte number 2048 and look for a TLV and whatnot, right? So this is the market direction right now, and IPPM group has the expertise to go in the right direction. So doing the BFD way, we're adding a new control channel signaling, as well as using a TLV with a long payload, where you don't know where to write timestamp, where to write a counter. I think this is against the direction where we are going.
Well,
Great, please hold your comments.
okay, I strongly disagree, and we can do it on the list. I explain why.
Martin Vigoureux. Jeff, you had as an introduction a sentence, I don't remember exactly, saying that BFD has a nice characteristic of being a simple communication channel between, I think that's what you said, it wasn't written.
It's not in the slides.
Yeah. I like that, but I find also that scary in the sense that I would be very concerned if BFD was being used to carry anything or something that doesn't relate from far to OEM.
Right, so I want to clarify my remark. I'm talking about BFD as a protocol, not necessarily BFD in terms of a given instance of it. So remember that BFD was largely stolen from the hello mechanisms of other routing protocols. This was a very simple mechanism that we lifted from somewhere else. We just happened to put an instance of it that could run really, really fast, really, really simple. And for the continuity check cases we've been using it for, it's been great. What I'm sort of suggesting is, I don't really think that we want to overload core continuity cases for BFD, with all this other stuff in many cases. We have things like authentication that we've had questions about. We've had features that we've actually built on top of things that made good sense over the years. And, so BFD succeeded in, scaling up the new things that BFD was for. But for other mechanisms that want these, constant conversations between two systems, the packet protocol, the packet format, and maybe some extra flexibility might provide plumbing that could be used on different sessions.
Understood. But it's not necessarily OEM anymore.
It's and that's the thing. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is a broader conversation. And thank you everyone who's not a normal BFD attendee. Please subscribe to the mailing list for this conversation. And really the conversation I think is, if we think that BFD as a protocol is useful for carrying this other stuff, to some extent the BFD charter is, we're about continuity. That work doesn't, have a lot of things happening from year to year. If this is BFD protocol format being used for other things, that's either potentially a new working group or completely different charter stuff for us, but it is not necessarily the core case of what we've been doing for continuity, for the last few years. Ketan.
Ketan Taralikar, Cisco. So I'm completely in favor of BFD being the continuity check mechanism, and the way it's been focused laser sharp on solving this problem. So whatever other extensions, like I think Santosh mentioned, which can improve the continuity check mechanism, I think we should continue doing that. But this thing about running another session, another protocol, another thing just to use the poll sequence. I mean, before we get down that path, we should look at what are the problems in, let's say, the existing mechanisms that are being discussed in IPPM. And Rakesh mentioned some of the directions that are being taken there. So we should look at what those are, and if there is a gap, and see how to fix that. So we should approach it that way rather than the other way. Thanks.
Albert Fu from Bloomberg. I just want to add a quick comment with what Greg was saying about there are no counters with BFD today. So we found with one of the major vendors, because the BFD is implemented in hardware we don't get any visibility to when packets are dropped. So that's actually one of the things I'm requesting the vendors to do, is to expose some of those counters so that we can at least see send and receive counters and get some statistics about how what the quality of the link is. So just that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and part of the conversation about the extensions, I think does, carry a lot of, weight to it. Things that we are looking for keep on running in the cases where we need to carry some extra data with us. We've had the performance measurement, we've had the presentation today. We know that these things need to be fast and simple, and again, whether or not we carry the mechanism through for use for other working groups is a longer term question. But there's also the related question of, do we carry a little bit of extra stuff specifically for our core use case? So, and that might be where we draw our line in the sand for work within BFD as a working group. For the continuity case, does it serve that purpose? And if so, how do we keep that, within the fast requirements that we've had over the years? For the other use cases where, again, we're just looking for a nice mechanism between two systems, that's something to look at is, a expanded charter or a move to other working group, mechanism. That one way this could potentially progress, as an example, and I'm recommending this a priori, if ITPM would like to actually have a mechanism to have this, inter-system carrier, BFD as a protocol is already specified. We know what its properties are. We know how it behaves. And if we're already looking at what a format would look like to carry such things, certainly we're happy to let them make use of that. But it would not be CC as we do today. Okay. Final comments?
Yes, I think it was presented as the RFC 6374 doesn't have any signaling mechanism right now. And this might be BFD might be a way to add a signaling for the 6374. And I think that's not the right argument for it.
Okay, so this is going to continue to be, I think, a longer conversation. Again, thank you for participating. What we'd like to do as our next steps here is take, several of these observations that we've had, try to distill them down a little bit and start a couple of threads on the mailing list. Probably one about extending BFD specifically for the continuity cases, and then BFD as a more general mechanism for other working groups to potentially use. And we'll carry it on from there. The second case specifically is likely going to require rechartering if we end up picking it up. If it's a matter of helping another group lift BFD packet formats and procedures, that's something that's already within our charter.
Yeah, I just want to mention is that I haven't had discussion in a break time with the Monet group there next room. And unfortunately, because of this conflict, they cannot come, but they got interested in this discussion. So let's include them too.
One thing I'm curious is how many people in the room read the draft? I mean, Greg's draft? Okay, it's pretty good.
Very good.
Okay, thank you. We'll take the rest of this to the mailing list and have some good conversations for this IETF.
What about BFD VXLAN? No time?
There's a social in a few minutes.